So let's we begin this panel discussion. That just before the break, we ended the last panel discussion with the perfect bridge, which was the last opinion by Frederique, that was taking back topics proposed in the lecture of Chilean philosopher Andrés Claro of yesterday night, opening the festival, of actually taking translation as a model for from which actually cultural institutions, which was the topic of the last panel discussion, could be much could be learned. And the topic, the title of this panel discussion is the role of translation in Westopia. So, and a bit more developed, the role of translation and translators in the literature scene of this imaginary country, this Westopia, like we've already left very clear as some kind of invented begriff between utopia and dystopia. So yeah, I would say quite a hopeful imaginary country, although made up of fears and repressions. So the topics I have proposed to the participants who are here, as already said, the Chilean philosopher Andrés Claro, Lea Schneider, poet and translator, and Odile Quenel, also poet and translator. And the three of them have been for many years engaged in translation, in particular translation of literature in its extreme, that of poetry, and also especially Odile, concerned with also cultural politics, and have been instrumental in the case, especially of Odile, of creating programs and scholarships for authors from diverse cultural backgrounds and languages, especially in Berlin, but also happily that model being exported to other regions of Germany. So topics I have proposed, for example, when I convoked them to this panel discussion, I told Odile that, and Lea that I would look forward for them to give light upon the difficulties involved of bringing to the German literary scene the source language and the source literature they translate. In the case of Odile, she translates from French, Portuguese, Spanish, although she has, of course, translated from other languages, as we will, she will later tell us in more detail. And Lea mainly from Chinese, although also you have much wider translational experience. And after them and through them also for Andrés Claro to comment from a perhaps more metaphysical perspective, and linking back to to his conference of yesterday with the translation and hospitality. So I leave the microphones to start to Odile Quenel.
Yes, hello. I'm not sure I responded to your requirement, because I understood that it was also about literature in a multilingual society, or multilingual literature in the society. So I will also talk about this and not only about translation.
Exactly, that's exactly what I meant by Westopia. That's
great.
What Westopia
okay.
is.
So yeah, I'm here as a poet and translator that happens to have grown up bilingual. So that plays, of course, a role in my writing and in my translating. And I would first like to question two concepts we're working with here actually all the time. The one is the one of monolinguism, as supposed to be the opposite of multilinguism, which in my eyes doesn't exist, because it's just a concept invented from a group of persons who consider themselves as such, and who consider themselves as a majority, or at least as normality, where they are just a minority and an exception. Because most people in this world, for several reasons, speak or grew up or speak or live in several languages, and so if there has been a switch in the German in the perception in the German literature scene, there's all this this aspect behind, because we are all multilingual, because we speak, for example, body language besides of speaking with our mouth or our hands, or and we have our family language, we have our personal language, we have our peer group language, class language, and in Germany a lot the dialects. So really, every person who speaks already speaks a lot of languages, and we have to consider this too when we translate, because we don't translate one language. And if you say monolinguism, you have the idea of a monolithic language, which doesn't exist. And the second thing I would like to question is that as a translator mainly of poetry, I don't translate cultures. I don't feel like a bridge. I translate poets and their poetics, rather than culture. And so, as I will show, a lot of problems in publishing or whatever, translated poetry is not so much a language question than a poetry problem or question. When I started to publish, and my first book, for example, was about growing up into languages, into cultures, and whatever, and I had the impression that it didn't interest the German society at all, because, and we talked about this already, there's a big mistrusting towards people who don't speak German as a mother tongue. Whether when you speak with accent, they think you can't write properly, and we even had a prize in Germany. You had to have a prize in Germany, the Camiso Prize, so that people who grew up in another language than German, but writing German, would get recognized. So that, for me, it was always incredible. Because if they write in German, they are just German writers with a different background, maybe, but they don't need a separate prize. So, that's probably the romantic burden of Germany, this mother tongue thing that is probably related to the motherhood thing that is as terrifying. So, and then all of a sudden, 20 years later, there was a shift, and all of a sudden, when you don't write in several languages, it's like you don't have any chance anymore. And I think, who decides about this? What is in and what is not in? And you write, I think you will talk about the hype that exists and whatever, and I just first felt, hey, I want to decide if I write also in French or not, or in both, or with other languages. I don't want, I feel almost forced, and then I just don't want to write anymore in several languages. It was like a bit of puberty reaction, but anyway. And the idea behind is also, and this concerns also translation, is that is kind of a mathematical thought of language, like as if I have several languages, I can add them somehow as entire entities that are somehow separated, where there's this French, I think he's sociologo, no sé cómo se dice, François Grosjean, who says you don't, if you are you speak bilingual. He doesn't say you speak a language in another language, you speak bilingual. And I really like this, because, it's again this, there's no monolithic language, and even when I speak German, I speak German with this French background, so. And then also you have always to prove that you speak a language perfect, and this, I think you will talk about this in translating, like they ask you, do you count in the other language, do you dream in the other language, like as there were, how to say, a counting, a measuring thing, whether you are allowed to be bilingual or to translate into the other language or from the other language. So that was just for the background, I think, of the specific German situation, I would say, or approach to language and to mother tongue and stuff like this. And then the other point I mentioned that I want to talk about is like translating poetry, and I won't say anything about how difficult it is to translate poetry, because I don't believe it's more difficult than prose. It's just differently difficult, and but I will talk about the structural problems you encounter when you try to publish translated poetry in Germany. And I would say it's a problem. I mean, literary structures are made for prose or for novel. You say book prize, you say literature prize, but it's always novel prizes. And so, just as an example, so I start with the publishers. Who publishes poetry at all? The small publishers. And for them to publish translated poetry is even more risky. So I've been translating poetry for about 20 years, and I feel it's more difficult every time to find an editor, because also the grant situation is quite good at the moment, and also there has been some changing with the Toledo program. My colleague Aurélie was supposed to be here, she's not, and where you also have grants in not only for translators into German, but also in the other direction. But still, usually you need a contract, and a contract with certain conditions, and the small editors are not able to give these conditions. Everybody knows it, everybody helps herself how she can, and so it's halfly illegal, but who cares? But I mean, it's really, the structures are not done for this, for the new situation that bigger editors just don't want to publish poetry because it's not for the market, basically. And then there is also hardly prices for translated poetry, and where, for example, first novels, when there's, for example, at Haus der Kultur in der Welt, first novels, they have a chance to get a translation prize for their translated version. Poets that are not known internationally, forget it. So what is translated, what gets the few prizes that are usually, not only, but usually mainly English and mainly canonized poetry, for example. So there's a big difference how prose, or I would say novels are treated, and poetry are treated. And talking about grants, there should be much more. First, I think there should be grants for poet translators, so that I can't separate my translation from my writing, and I talk about osmotic translation, and there are some grants where you can apply to go to country for translation and to translate something. I would like to have a grant for both, for writing and translating, because of course if I go in a country, I will try to get to know the scene, the poetic scene, and I will try to translate people, and I think there should be this possibility, to mix it more up. And then another really important thing is that there should be grants for collective work, and not just, we translate the two of us, but then on partage, how to say, wir teilen das Geld auch, sondern wir wollen beide das gleiche Geld. Because, for example, I translated this great Armenian poet, Violet Grigoryan, and we worked together on, I learned Armenian for 2 years as far as I could, just to get to know how the language functions, and I think we talk about this. And then I got her a grant at the LCB, and then we worked together for a year, for a month, and it was really great, a great work together. And then we tried to get her a grant at the HU, at the Humboldt Uni, and there was a professor who was really engaged and whatever. But the jury said, well, we don't have enough translated stuff from her, and she's one of the most known poets in Armenia, and so we wanted to invite her so that she can live a year from the money there, but also to work together. So, and the argument was there's not enough translated poetry. So I think the structures as they are reproduce especially the translation from English poetry, but also, of course, from bigger languages like French or Spanish, and as smaller, entre guillemets, it gets, the more difficult it gets to find publishers, to find grants, to find, yeah.
Thank you, Odile. Excellent beginning. Also a very organic link with the previous panel of cultural policy. And for sure, once each of the speakers has made an initial statement, we, just like in the previous panel, we open it as a naturally evolving conversation, because of course the representatives of cultural institutions here present are of course directly addressed by these topics, and we look forward to your contribution too. And also thank you for starting by undermining and sort of deconstructing some of the premises with which we have convoked this collective imagined Westopian country or continent. And to follow on, speaking about translation as a model from which we can learn, comes Lea Schneider.
Thank you. Actually, I feel like Odile already said everything, and I don't really know how to follow it up without repeating what you already put so eloquently, but I will try. I didn't write out a speech, so bear with me if I get lost somewhere. I'll try to make this quick and concise. I just wanted to point out before I really start that there's a wonderful book by the literary scholar Yasemin Yildiz, who's a German literary scholar, called Beyond the Mother Tongue, the Post-Monolingual Condition. And if you ever want to read anything on the fantasy of monolingualism and how it's entangled with the history of nationalism, especially in Germany, but in all European countries, I'd say this is the book to go to. So I won't talk about that, just read her book if you're interested. I guess most people here know everything that's in there already anyway. Yeah. So I want to say one thing about translating Chinese poetry into German, because Thomas invited us to elaborate on like our special perspective. But before I do that, I want to bring in 2 points that maybe kind of complicate the notion of the translator as someone building bridges, or as a special example we can all learn from. So please excuse me for kind of starting to problematize our idea at the very beginning. One thing is, you already mentioned that, Odile, that I feel currently there's kind of a hype for multilinguality or for multilingualism, at least in certain circles. And the problem that I have with this hype, which I see it as a literary scholar. I work at FU Berlin too, as a literary scholar, but I also see it as a poet, as someone going to international poetry festivals. And one could argue I can also see it here in the theme of this conference. So my problem with this current hype for multilinguality is that it is usually presented as universal, but in fact always restricted to European languages or to Indo-European languages. I think it's possible right now, if you move in certain circles, that you can earn a certain prestige by being multilingual or by writing multilingually. It's proof of your cosmopolitic mindset, it's proof of your superior education, and so on and so on, for writers and academics alike. But the expected forms of interlinguality, so the way we are expecting this multilinguality to show up in writing, they are all not possible, for example, between German and Chinese. Because we expect this multilinguality to show up in certain forms of wordplay, of mixing the vocabulary of different languages, but still kind of being able to get the meaning even if we don't speak the language. And there are wonderful ways to mix German and English, French and Spanish, and so on and so on. I think it's also possible with Russian. But if you go to a language which has a different writing system, or which is not related to this Indo-European language family, you have a whole different story. And there are amazing possibilities to interlace these languages too, but they just don't work on the level we expect multilinguality to look like. So that's one thing I would like to complicate or problematisieren. Sorry. And the other thing is something Odile also already mentioned, which is in my eyes, very problematic notion of the translator as a master of their languages. So especially when you translate poetry, like when I meet people and I tell them I translate Chinese poetry, they usually react with shocked amazement, and they're like, oh, you must be perfectly fluent in the language. What a heroic thing to do, to translate poetry and then from Chinese. And the thing is, my Chinese is far from fluent. And I think that's even a good thing for translating Chinese poetry, because what you need to be fluent in to translate poetry is poetry and not a language. Of course, you need to have a knowledge of the language, you need to have respect for the language, you need to want to find out more about the language, but the important part is that in your target language, you create a poem. And I think this notion of the translator is somebody who first has to master a language completely and perfectly before they are allowed to translate is very problematic, because especially for languages like Chinese or other languages that are not taught in German schools and not studied that much at German universities, it just makes the pool of people who are even able to start to translate so small that in the end you end up having like 1, 2, 3 people translating Chinese poetry, if at all. And that's, yeah, that keeps a lot of people out of the conversation, away from the table, who would be able to contribute wonderful translations. There is in Chinese studies a notion which is called the Sinosphere, or the Sinophone world, die Sinosphäre. And the idea behind this is that everybody who engages with the Chinese language, be it somebody growing up in mainland China, or in Taiwan, or in Singapore, or in Hong Kong, or in the Chinese diaspora, which is spread out all over the world, or somebody sitting in a German classroom having their very first language session in Chinese, they all equally have a right to define this language or to engage with this language. And I think that's a beautiful idea, and it's totally possible to carry it over to the German-speaking world, because, as Odile already said, German has lots of dialects, German has lots of learners from all kinds of different language backgrounds. German is spoken in different language, in different countries all across the world for different historical reasons. And I like this idea to kind of say everybody who starts to engage with the language, for what reason ever, has a right to be like an equal member of that language community. And I would love to bring that notion to translating, to the process of translating, and invite everybody who is interested, who has like a real interest in engaging with the language respectfully and learning, to take part in translating. I mean, especially for poetry, there are lots of also like historical examples of poets translating languages, and also contemporary examples of poets translating languages they don't know, yes, with the help of others. And that also relates to what you said before. I would love to have much more opportunities to get funding for and to make visible collaborations. I did so many collaborations with Chinese poets, Chinese speakers, Chinese readers who helped me to get the meaning of poems and translating them. And I always try to have their names on the book covers too, but it's something I always have to fight for. And there are almost no possibilities to get fundings for teams of people or for collectives to do this stuff. So there are different aspects of this greater visibility I would wish for collaborations in translation, and for kind of getting away from this image of the genius master translator who has a fluent language and fluent knowledge in all the languages she translates from.
Do you think that projects such as the Verschmuggel are a step forward in that direction?
I think so. I mean, this project has a long tradition, and it actually comes from the GDR, where they did I think pretty much all poetry translations like that, that they asked poets to translate via the help of people who know the language they're translating from very well. Yeah.
There's this problem that usually they are not mentioned. So it's written, translated from, I'm talking now about Verschmuggel.
Yeah, this project.
And you think, well, okay, but at least the base should be mentioned, on base of a translation of, or something like that, because if not, we talk about invisibility.
Yeah, to put Andres in context, is basically this project in which, there's several hands involved, in which a translator does some kind of literal version or serves as some kind of medium. And there's a poet who doesn't necessarily know the source language and but is a poet in the target language, German being.
And then I wanted to say one last thing about, because we are talking about the role of translators in a future Westopia, if it's ever going to exist, hopefully. And I just wanted to bring in one point from my perspective as a translator from Chinese. I think it's because there's one special obstacle that I'm always facing when I translate Chinese literature into German, and I think maybe somebody translating from Arabic or Turkish or some other languages who are conceived as the others of Europe might have a similar problem. But what I'm always kind of translating against, wogegen ich anübersetze, is the notion that China is so fundamentally different from Germany or from Europe that it is completely impossible for us to understand Chinese culture and language. And of course, this notion has like a long colonial history. I think it probably started somewhere with Hegel, who started this notion of China as Europe's great other, as he puts it. But for me, it just illustrates that every translation is a political act insofar as we don't just translate into a blank neutral space. There are ideological and political images of the languages we translate from and of the cultures we translate from. And I think we have to consider them in our translations or in our translation strategies. Because our translations will become a part of the picture the German audience has of the other language, of the other culture. So in my special case of translating Chinese poetry into German, I always try to choose to underline the similarities of German and Chinese, because they're actually enormous. Like the grammar of both languages is so much alike. The way foreign words are integrated, the way you build up words, it's very, very similar. And there are centuries of history of exchange and translation and interdependence between China and Europe, between China and Germany. I could give you a million of examples, like for example, Bertolt Brecht created the Verfremdungseffekt. So like one of the most important steps in German theater history of the last century, after seeing a Chinese performer in Moscow at a theater festival and learning from him. And the other way around, I think back in the 1920s, Die Leiden des jungen Werther, The Sorrows of Young Werther, was the best-selling novel in China. And people don't know about this because we have this notion of China as the great other, as the completely impossible to understand culture. So this is very, like, especially from my perspective, but I wanted to bring this in if we talk about the role of translators as political activists too.
And you made the contemporary poetry really visible in Germany with your anthology, because this about what is allowed to be poetry from China too, no?
We had this. Sorry, I will let you speak in a second. But we had this yesterday in the opening speeches. This problem that we often encounter, that writers from third world countries or non-European languages are supposed to have a topic they write about, like their post-colonial struggle or how they try to get visibility in the world. And Western, quote-unquote, Western authors are allowed to do all those avant-garde, formalistic wordplay stuff. And this was very much true, or I think it's still very much true for Chinese authors coming to Germany. They are either like all those poor dissidents who get trampled by the government and try to talk about human rights, or they do this exotic stuff we can't really translate, but it has something to do with bamboo and wild cranes and I don't know, jasmine tea or something. So yeah, this is what we get, right? But actually viewing them as authors, as poets, trying to work with language, trying to figure out something about the world by doing their craft, which is language, that just doesn't happen.
True. Thank you very much, Leah. Yeah, in the case of Chilean literature, when one looks at the contemporary scene or especially the last let's say 30, 40 years. Also, the way that the still open traumas and of the Chile's recent past due to its fascist dictatorship have been internationally sort of. There's been some kind of encouragement to for them to be almost. And then there's the. Hello. No, yeah, there it is. So that there's this expectation exactly that this Latin American literature has to be, be speaking about these topics, and that's what makes it interesting. And then exactly this sort of formalistic wordplay, just to put an example as a contrast, is of course not welcome at all. And Andrés, I believe you have already possible comments upon the previous contributions.
Yeah. I mean, I might disappoint your metaphysical expectations.
That was just
it was brought here to theorize about translation as a culture of mediation and hospitality, and Tomás now added this metaphysical horizon to my what I'm going to say. But actually, the positions of everything I said yesterday in that long lecture come from the fact that I do translate poetry. I do a lot of poetry in a very Latin American way, to say this very dilettante way. For I have translated poetry, and what I translate is the actual behavior of the materiality of a language. I don't translate words. From several languages, some of which I don't know in the way people, well, although you have this problem, which I think is great, this problem you were talking about, but I've translated from languages that I don't know in the way people think that you should know a language to translate. I mean, definitely you won't be agreeing. That is, on the one hand, I have translated poetry from tongues I can presume to know, like English or French, or languages that are very similar to Spanish, like Portuguese, Italian, let's say. But medieval Provençal, I've also translated from Latin, which is not that far. But I also translated poetry from very distant languages, in the geographical and in the linguistical sense, such as, for instance, Chinese. I have published a lot of poetry translated for Chinese. I have translated a book, this is a book of Japanese haikus, and these are languages I don't know, I cannot even say that I don't know well. I would have to say I don't know at all, although I know how they work. I know how it works, and especially I know how the prosody works. And obviously I've translated help by other people. And this it's to, in a way, to agree with what Lea was saying, and Odile as well, is that to translate poetry, although I disagree, I think to translate poetry is a bit more difficult to translate non-literary prose. I think literary prose is as difficult, but to translate Ulysses or to translate Finnegan's Wake is as difficult. But if you translate something that is not literary prose, like the prose I'm using now, it might be easier. But now, so what I do translate is basically I put attention to the behaviors of language, let's say the musical, the verbal music, or the textual or the prosodical, the images, etc. And in this sense, as I said, in the same direction that Odile and Lea before, I would just add that literary translation, and especially the translation of poetry, is not about knowing perfectly well a foreign language. It's not about penetrating and breaking a code, as philologists normally understand the language. It's about understanding the difference of another language with your own language, and especially about having the creative capacity to make your own language behave in the way a foreign language works. This is why, and I have nothing against philology, I mean, it's a great study, but this is why normally philologists are not very good literary translators, because they are trained to break a code, to understand exactly what the word means. I mean, although, as Borges once said, etymology teaches what the words no longer mean.
Very well.
I know that German philosophers are not going to like this, because there's a whole school of paraphilology in Germany, in which they interpret philology. I mean, they think that the origin of a word is the truth about reality, which is a discussable hypothesis, but I'm not going to enter into that. I'm just going to say that the key here for good translation is to find the way that your own language behaves in the way a foreign language does. And that has to be done with a different materiality, with different, for instance, to translate the music of poetry is extremely difficult because you have to recreate a sound machine with the sounds of a new language. It's like transposing music from one instrument to another, but like, let's say from a full orchestra to a flute. You see, that it's a difficult task. I was reading you yesterday this poem of Wallace Stevens, Banthams in Pinewoods. There are very miracles of translating poetry, the music of poetry. Listen to one of them, for instance. It's the most difficult. In poetry, when you translate music in poetry, you have to recreate. It's different with images, which is very easy. Let's say a little Provençal song, which is an alba, a dawn song. It sounds like this in Provençal, and see how the vowels get dark in the night and then they open. Sorry, I'm going to try to use one hand. Quan lo rossinyol s'escria, absapar la nuega el dia, i uisuiat ma bella mia, jos la flor, tro la gaita de la tor, escria, druts al levar, que vei l'alba, el John clar. Now listen. When the nightingale to his mate sings day long and night late, my love and I keep stayed. In bower, in flower, yet the watchman in the tower cries, up thou rascal, rise, I see the white light, and the night flies. Well, that's not me, that's Pound. But that's the translation of music, where you have exactly the modulation of the vowels that get dark and they open again. And it's something that you need to recreate completely. Whereas when you privilege images, it's very easy. Images translate very easily, and that makes it what you were saying before, that to translate, let's say, classical Chinese poetry, which is something I've translated from the Shijing, which is the Book of Odes, which is 3,000 years old, till the Tang period, so 8th century. That's a very old poetry, but it obviously has music, it has rhyme, it has tones. That is very difficult, it's impossible to reproduce the tonal system of the Chinese. But it also has strong images, and especially change of points of view, which is what normally we identify with Chinese poetry, this kind of cinematic way of working. That is very easy to translate into Spanish because it's images, as if you translate montage, or you translate a metaphor, or you translate a surrealist image, like, let's say, a bad, whatever, por ti pintan de azul los hospitales, Neruda. That's easy to translate into French or into English because it's an image, and the images pass easily. That's why surrealist poetry had such a great impact, because it was easily translatable. And then when you translate irony, that is, again, you have to paraphrase, you have to recreate, unless the contexts are very different, or any contextual effect, let's say an allusion, a connotation, an irony. If the context change, this contextual effect, its contextual way of charging meaning, is not going to work. Let's say Nicanor Parra, who's a Chilean poet, an expert on contextual effects. He's always playing with the expectations of the audience. The cover of one of his little artifact poems is the cover of his complete works that was published in Spain recently. And it's an empty crucifix that says voy y vuelvo, which instead of inri says, basically, literally in Spanish will be I go and come back. But that doesn't work in English because it's not what you put in a store when you go for lunch. So if you translate that into English, you will have to put the cross and put something like, whatever, gone fishing, out for lunch.
Feierabend.
Yeah, be right back.
Feierabend vielleicht.
Gone fishing would be maybe in England, which is an old way of saying. Or if you translate it into a Buddhist culture, you'll probably have to change the cross for the empty
Buddha throne.
Yeah, the empty seat of the Buddha, because that's a contextual effect. It's playing with the expectations of the audience, and if you change context. So different values that require very different strategies when you translate poetry. And coming back to Odile. That's why sometimes some poetries which are very far away in time or geographically, like Chinese, oh no, I'm not saying it's or other, I'm just saying it's far away in time, translate easily into so-called Western languages than poetries that are completely part of the tradition, as the troubadour poetry, or let's say in German, the Minnesänger, however that's pronounced, which is difficult to translate because it's musically based poetry. Well, I think I'm probably extending myself too long. I'm going to say something about what you said before. I was going to speak a bit about the translation between the arts, which is something that has not been mentioned here. I mean, I'm just going to say the premise. I'm not going to develop this. If translation is not about penetrating a meaning and reproducing exactly the same meaning, but actually understanding that the meaning is produced by a behavior in language. And if you put attention to that behavior in language, something that is very, very important and that create enormous revolutions in the ways of representing reality is how an art looks to another and takes its formal behavior and incorporates it. For instance, if you take the story of montage in the 20th century, only 100 years since montage was developed by the avant-garde, and today it completely dominates our daily life. It completely shapes the way we represent reality. And montage was very influenced by Chinese poetry when it was developed by the Imagist in poetry. Then Cubist art developed the montage as a perspectivism, analytical and synthetic cubism. Then came cinema. We always think that cinema was first. Cinema came later, Einstein was looking at Chinese poetry, Japanese theater, was looking also at the idea of montage in architecture. So then came montage as a way of understanding the city, this collage idea of the city. And montage, and then obviously came the idea of using montage in all devices, which we use now all the time. So, and that was a way in which the arts were paying attention not to meaning, they were paying attention to the formal behavior of another art and bringing it to their own art, to their own materiality. So that's something I would be glad to talk if we have the time. And the third thing was about the more philosophical thing that Thomas wants me to speak. But I think I pontificated a lot yesterday about that. And I mean, you have enough philosophers in German, I suppose, for me to come from Chile and try to say, you know, I mean, I remind you all the things I said yesterday very quickly. I mean, I was speaking about these 4 variations in which translation had to do with recognizing a certain limit in the foreigner, this pretension, this impossible pretension of grasping the meaning of the foreign, and how it becomes a hospitality to the ways of behavior of the foreign, and hospitality that it has to go beyond the limited of hospitality of hosting the foreign for our own benefit. I mean, this is what it's called in France, l'immigration choisie, c'est-à-dire we're going to bring the people that we need. But that's not hospitality, that's just like bring it for your own convenience. So you have this absolute hospitality in which you have to be open to what the foreign, the way the foreign behaves in your own soul, so in a non-anticipable way. And finally, and this goes directly to what Odile was saying, the idea that this synchronic and diachronic hospitality in time and in place creates this kind of marrano language, this kind of interbreeding languages, which is a new model to think institutionality and to think about the subject as well, as about our own constitution. Odile was speaking before about this idea that monolingualism doesn't exist. Every time we say I, there are several languages that they are speaking. There's a phrase you can maybe like or not, but it's a phrase, I think it's in Le monolingualisme de l'autre, that says, the phrase is something like,
she knows it by heart.
Je n'ai qu'une langue, et c'est pas la mienne. So I only have one language, and it's not mine. Every language, not only because of the fact that we can differentiate between one is la langue and la parole. I mean, everyone has his own language, his own behavior, his mixture of gestuality, etc., his tone. But also the fact that every language is a construct. There's no, I mean, coming back to etymology, I say this because this is a very German fantasy, the idea of origins, the idea that you can go back to certain origins which will tell you the truth about things. Those origins are always completely contaminated. Contaminated is not even the word. They are always crossbreedings. Origins are already created by mixtures.
There is no origin.
There's no origin. Well, that's a way of saying it another way. So now, because Thomas, and this is the last, I'll just react to what Odile said. This monolingualism, I mean, I remember that phrase, that kind of paradox that you have only one language and it's not yours. And you have probably seen how languages work in our 3 Englishes, because they are very different. I mean, yours is gravitated, it's pulled by your German and your French. Yours is pulled by your German and probably American. I mean, you have an American. Mine is pulled by Latin American, also the time I spend in England. So every English is different. They are pulled by different languages. So, I mean, and then about what Lea was saying, just the last thing I'm going to comment, because I thought it was very important what Lea said about this hype for multilingualism. it's funny because for us multilingualism in Latin America is like is like how you are raised. Even it might not be English. I mean, it might be local languages, and also the fact that there's this fantasy that you have different Spanishes in Latin America. They're not different Spanishes; they're different languages. I mean, Argentina is not a variety of Castilian, and Chile another variety of Castilian, and Colombia another variety of Castilian, Bolivian. They're all different languages. So we learn, we see TV, we learn all these languages without realizing that we speak several languages. Then we read a lot of in translation, and translation is ubiquitous in that sense. So for this idea of the hype for us is not the way it works for us, because it's not something recent. It's just something that it has become explicit recently, and actually it's not that explicit in Latin America because we don't have translation studies and all that. But what is weird is that since the 19th century, since the Romantic period, every single author in Latin America has spoken or written about translation. I mean, obviously, probably the world, because it's something that it's there, and it's also our emancipation. And this is really the last thing I say. Our emancipation from Spain had a lot to do with changing our Spanish from other languages, from local languages, but also from English, from French, from the first person that was named in Latin America, who was Argentinian, in the Academy of Spain, refused it. And refused it because the first rule of the Academy of Spain was to preserve the purity of Spanish language. And he wrote a letter of refusal saying, this is exactly what we're trying to attack here in Latin America. Our emancipation consists in penetrating Spanish by all the languages of the world, which is the same idea of Borges later on when he says in Tradition and the Argentinian Writer, he says, we are in and out the Western tradition, as the Irish, as the Jews. We can deal with the whole tradition, for instance, the universe, like very Borges says, but we don't need to respect it. So it's this idea of mixing, of creating this kind of dilettante mixture of languages, and it really comes with the idea of emancipating America from Spain as well, of creating our own Spanish in which we allow ourselves to incorporate whatever we want. We are not part of a tradition, so we can. Our libraries have German books, French books, English books, Aymara books, Quechua books, Mapuche books, and we don't feel that we have to choose the way sometimes in the genealogies in Europe you feel you have to choose. And now you're interbreeding. But it's a recent process. For us, it's like a constitutional state. Sorry, this was long. Thank you very much.
But it's about this idea of a perfect language. I mean, it's on the opposite of this. There could be a perfect Spanish language or something. You know, the real one. It's a really a European thought. And what did I want to say? I forgot.
But I think it's important what you just pointed out, that this kind of hype I was talking about seems to me a very German thing. I do know it a little bit from the English-speaking world too, where it always makes me wonder, because English is there are so many Englishes all over the world. So if there's one language which should be practiced and being more than one language, it should be English. But yeah, in German it is so much connected to this powerful fantasy of like one language, one nation, and so on, and all the horror, you know, all the horrors connected to that. And it still shows today, like I mean, I think what I was trying to point out by talking about this hype is that there is a different prestige given to each language. Because what this hype, like in academic literary studies, for example, is looking for is people who mix English and French and German, you know, but not maybe Spanish, but not people who mix Turkish and German, for example. And yeah, I just think it's very interesting that people like celebrate multilinguality, but they're actually just looking for very specific languages. And if somebody who grows up like bilingual or even trilingual or with lots of languages and mixes them, but these languages happen to be like Turkish or Arabic or Kurdish or Vietnamese and German, this is looked down upon, and this is actually a big problem, because then you're not a proper German speaker and you're not probably integrated into society, and you should go and take some more German classes. And I think it's super interesting to see how multilinguality that is now celebrated in poetry. Like, I mean, we have to face the fact that poetry is a very elite art form, right? This multilinguality has been around in hip-hop and rap culture for much longer, and I think in a much more art and craftful way than it is done in poetry, at least the examples I know of, with lots of different languages.
Yeah. Just a question for you. So there's no German Turkish literature?
There is, of course, no,
Yeah.
totally. I was talking about people. Yeah, I was talking about people in positions to kind of deal out money and
Okay,
prestige,
okay.
and of course it does not go for everyone. So I don't want to like bash everyone in these positions, but I do witness it in a literary studies perspective a lot. Like the people who are the works that are chosen as part of a curriculum that I read in university, the works that get big prizes and awards too, and that are given as perfect examples of how international and multilingual German poetry is now. Like one poet who I adore, I love her work, for example, Uljana Wolf. She mixes German and English. English is her second language, and she mixes those languages, and she does so beautifully. But she is always given as like this great example of how multilingual international German poetry is today. And it's just so weird to me, because it's these two languages that almost everybody in Germany knows at least a little bit. So it's not really about confronting something foreign, something you can't make sense of in the first moment, because with all of her poems, you'll be able to understand both languages. It's not really multilingual. It's not really confronting the other or something foreign or something you can't make sense of in the first place.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that example. I was thinking exactly the same. And then, I would like, because of, especially because of time limitations, I would like to open now the conversation also to anyone who here has a question, or especially the representatives of cultural institutions, if they felt at risk, or if they felt particularly, they were attracted particularly to any of the ways in which translation was was mentioned as a model from which cultural institutions such as yours could learn from.
I feel a little bit helpless to answer this. Maybe I would like to return the question, what do you expect that we could learn from it? I don't know, because we are not especially focused on translations. And what I personally feel confirmed by what I do in my leisure time, if I have time, and it's not a lot, then I think one of the most beautiful challenges is to put on music and then look for a poem in a language I don't know and try to translate it. I do it. I practice this without any ambitions to publish or whatever. But I think, I think it's a very good practice and a cultural attitude to say we say goodbye to all this perfect, perfect competencies, perfect. I think this kind of dilettantism, which had a very good reputation in the 20s in Germany, dilettantismus as a part or as the ground of creativity, and I think that's still true. No, I think I can't grasp anything what we could put into practice or what could change our programs. I think this is on a level of creativity of a certain behavior, position. But what or maybe the point I can connect with is the what Leah said. Translation is political activism, and we deal a lot with projects of political activists, and so I think we should, when we sometimes we plan to invite political activists within a group of scientists, philosophers, artists, and so on. And then we also think about political activists, and maybe the next political activist we could think about could be a translator.
Yes. Daniel?
I would state that I felt addressed by Odile's statement about the novelism in terms of the prize or award-winning categories.
You're not the only one.
Yes, that's true. And actually, I don't make the rules for the prize, so I don't feel responsible for that. But it gave me food for thought to how to rethink the prize, because with the current period of our current director, also probably the ELP period will end or change, so it's time for reinventing it, and that's a good impulse for that. And for my own practice, I got some good input from Leah about the quality of translation, or how to think not from language to language, but in this poetry mode, which I never really thought about. But if I had heard this like half a year before, it would have made my life so much easier doing these books. In terms of when I was responsible for also the translations and evaluating it, when one of my authors insisted that the translator is chosen purely on identity categories and not on the work done as a translator, and to navigate all this. Yeah, so maybe we can exchange a little bit more about this later.
Very glad to hear that such connections and links and bridges are being built here out of thin air. And so yeah, to extend these possibilities for example, appreciating back dilettantism, also maybe more lab sort of instances like this example of Schmugel, where poetry is collective work and opening up. Also, if we are to take translation as a model, we have to regard also and start by deconstructing this myths about translation that I'm glad that appealed to you both about the total mastery of the language, and also paying crucial attention to if we're taking as a model the translation of poetry, that it's about a behavior of the language, as Andres very strikingly put it. And for our last contribution, we have another opinion here.
Yeah, maybe I can say a few words from the perspective of the German Translators Fund that I work for. I will surely take home some impulses of the points that you mentioned, but I would also like to point out that a few things in the funding of literary translators have improved. I think it's not only the German as the language to translate into that we fund, but also the other way around, which is kind of new. The collaborative translation is coming more and more into our spectrum of translating. Also the sign language. I remember like 10 years ago, there was some kind of request, like, would you fund this project? And we were like, sign translation? Not really our business. That was, it just wasn't on our mind. And now it's changed a lot. So I think the idea of translating is widening up even for a funding translation, which is a bit slow because it's a public institution, but we're learning and we're trying to improve. And I think with all the programs that are new, things are getting better. And of course, we will stay in a dialogue to improve things together.
And may
Great.
I add one thing? This publishing aspect. I mean, I know it's not directly your institution, but on a German level, the small editors really, it's a really difficult thing because they have to, die müssen einfach Marktkriterien erfüllen, die sie nicht erfüllen können. Und das ist wirklich ein Problem. Die können keine Gelder bekommen als Verlage und so weiter. Also da muss ganz viel, glaube ich, gemacht werden auf der strukturellen Ebene, wenn man Poesie, wie soll ich sagen, in anderen Sprachen oder lesen will oder aus anderen Sprachen lesen will.
And that, of course, the publishing situation, the situation of the publishing houses is, of course, interdependent of the andere Ebene, the other angles from which we have addressed this question, which, the prices and the sort of the highest level of cultural institutions, funding programs, etc. So, well, at least I think we've seen from afar the coast of this imaginary Westopian country, and I'm super happy about the way the conversation evolved. Like I said before, in such a wonderfully organic way related to the previous panel, and now we have to close, and there will. All of our program is kind of interbreeds with the topics we have addressed today.